Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made a really cool looking Warhammer diorama. A buddy of mine has been trying to convince me to make one for him for a while. The trouble is, I never really knew what I could make that would be a good fit for it. That was until he started to explain a little bit more about the latest minis he's just painted. So apparently, these space marines followed a dude named Horus onto a planet called Davin that was corrupted by chaos? I don't know, something like that. But when he mentioned the word swamp, that really piqued my interest because that's definitely something I can do. So the first thing I needed to do was just sort of get a rough idea of where I wanted the space marines to sit. I knew I wanted to put some trees on this piece, so I made sure I left enough room for those. Next, it was time to make some ground forms. So on my pine base, I applied a little bit of wood glue. And then I stuck down some polystyrene foam. Nothing fancy, this is just cheap packing foam. Then, once it had dried, I could use the blowtorch to make some undulations in the polystyrene. If you are going to use this technique, please make sure you wear a mask because it can get a bit smelly. So I knew I was going to want the Space Marines to sit a little bit higher than the actual bottom level, so I cut a few thinner pieces of polystyrene and just used some hot glue to pin them in place. So to create the rest of the ground forms, I needed to mix up a little bit of modelling compound. I mixed the first batch a little thinner than usual. This was just to make sure any holes in the melted foam would get sealed in. Then I mixed up a much thicker second batch so I could create a few more landforms. Once it was nearly dry, I started to smooth that out using my finger, paying particular attention to the tops, just where I knew the miniatures were going to sit. While the modelling compound was drying, I then come in with some wood filler, just to smooth out that polystyrene. Then I gave it a quick sand, just to get a nice smooth finish. Once that had all dried, I gave everything a good coat of some watered down PVA glue. This is about a 50-50 mix. And then sprinkled some fine sand on top just so I could get a nice texture. This then dried to form a nice crust on top of the modelling compound. Then I could mix up some gesso and just prime the base. This step isn't usually necessary, but I knew I'd be mixing up a ground texture paste, so I just wanted to make sure it definitely had something to stick to. The texture paste is pretty easy to make. You just need a good amount of acrylic modelling paste, some fine sand, a little dried dirt from the garden, and a touch of brown paint. This needs mixing thoroughly until it forms a stiff paste. Then we can start applying it to the base. I used a wet paintbrush in some spots just to make it a little bit easier to apply. I needed to make sure the miniatures weren't going to move once they were sat on the base, so I used an unpainted mini, pressed it into some of the ground texture, just to leave an area where I knew it could sit nicely. I could then tidy up the overspill with the wet paintbrush. I'd done this for each spot where the miniatures were going to sit, and then left it overnight to dry. Then it was time to make some trees. I used some natural tree roots for this that had been disinfected and dried out in the oven. To attach them to the baseboard, I just made a small hole in the bottom of each tree and then applied some super glue and a small pin. Then I could just push them straight into the base. Then, using some smaller pieces, I could place them by the base of the trees to look like exposed roots. Once I was happy with the positioning, I could then super glue everything in place. Using a similar mixture to the modelling paste that we made earlier, I can use this to just bury the bottoms of the trees just to get a bit more of a natural look. And while the modelling paste was still wet, I sprinkled a little fine dirt over the top. And some larger pieces scattered around the surface. Then I used some gravel and sand fixer from AK just to lock everything in place. Applying static grass to the base was going to be impossible. I didn't leave myself enough room with the overhang from the trees, so instead I used a little bit of grass matting from Gauge Master. This is their 12mm variety. I just tore off small pieces and stuck them down to the base using matte Mod Podge. I used the back of the paintbrush just to push them into place. Then using the airbrush, I primed the entire base black using some thinned down gesso. The grass tufts were the first things to be painted. I used an aged white from Vallejo through the airbrush just to give them a good base coat. Then I added various shades of greens and yellows into the tufts. This gives for a much more natural look. The black primer also gives it a little bit of depth underneath. Then I base coated all of the exposed roots using a wood colour. Then I used dark earth from Vallejo to base coat the dirt. To add some variation in the colour on the roots, I used a wet blend technique. I brushed on some yellow olive from Vallejo, and a touch of burnt umber. Then I blended everything together just with a little bit of tap water. I then picked out some of the bigger stones and painted them in a variety of colours, just to make some of those details pop. To add some more depth to the mud, I used a couple of different enamel washes. I applied a dark grey in the lower spots. And earth effects from AK on the higher spots. I used a little white spirit to blend these together. Then, using some aged white, I dry brushed the high points of the ground and the bases of the trees. Then it was time to create some moss effects. I applied a little matte Mod Podge to the bottom of the roots, and then sprinkled over some Woodland Scenics fine turf. This is the burnt grass variety. To build the moss blankets up even further, I flooded it with some watered down PVA glue, and then added another layer of fine turf on top. Fine turf then acts like a sponge and it absorbs everything, including paint. So I watered down a variety of shades of green and just dabbed it into the foam. And then just blend everything together with a little bit more water. The next step was to apply vegetation to the piece. All the products I've used here are from Diorama Precipe. This is easily one of my favourite parts of any project, and the products they supply really help to bring the piece to life. I just used a little bit of matte Mod Podge to hold everything in place. So as this was a Warhammer diorama, I decided it needed a few extra details. These resin skulls were absolutely perfect for the job. Now, I'm no mini painter, so I kept the paint job simple. I just primed them with a medium grey. Then I base coated them with a nice bone colour from Citadel. And then I finished them off with a little bit of Agrax Earthshade. Then I had a nice bunch of skulls that were ready to apply to the base. These were all held in place with a dab of matte Mod Podge. Then it was time to prep for resin. For the dam, I used a high-grade painter's masking tape just to seal off all the edges. I then applied a little bit of gloss Mod Podge in the areas that I thought might be potential leaking spots. I then applied a bead of wood glue around the entire edge of the masking tape, just to really make sure we weren't going to have any leaks. I then poured the resin as per the instructions to a 50-50 mix. tried to stir it quite slowly so I didn't introduce too many bubbles. To tint the resin, I used a touch of Nurgle's Rock from Citadel. The pigment in the paint was being quite stubborn, so it really took some mixing to get it to this stage. Then it was time to pour. I poured the resin reasonably slowly, starting in the middle and working my way outwards. Then I could come in with the torch, just to pop any bubbles that had come to the surface. The next day, I was greeted with a really nice glassy surface. Then I could remove all the masking tape. I removed the edges of the resin with a sharp knife where it had started to climb up the tape. So to try and make the swamp water look a little more swampy, I dabbed some various green shades over the top to try and make some sort of scum. And once that had dried, I applied some more Nurgle's Rock on top of that. And then to give it a little bit more texture, I applied some gloss Mod Podge over the top. And while that was still wet, I used the airbrush just to push it around and create some really nice ripple effect. Then to finish off, I painted the sides of the piece with some black gesso. So that brings us to the end of this video. Thanks so much for watching. Please let me know what you think in the comment section below. I had a lot of fun putting this piece together, so hopefully my friend's really going to like it. And now I can officially say I've made a Warhammer diorama. And sorry about my drony voiceover, it's definitely something I'm going to have to work on in future videos. But thanks so much again for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.